Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to a panel on open financial data and what's been going on in the executive branch of the government here in Washington. My name is Mark Bolgiano. Most of you that know me from my work at XBRL during the initial project, and I'm now chairman at the Data Society, where we're working to move the needle on data literacy. Now that we've solved the supply problem, now we have to create some demand. I want to let the panelists introduce themselves. We've worked on some questions, but we also want to reserve about 15 minutes towards the end for Q&A from the audience. So keep that in mind, and if you have a question, you'll get a chance to ask it directly to the panel. Thanks.
I'm Scott Bogus. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis at the SEC. It's one of 5 divisions, and we basically support the Division of Enforcement, 3 policy divisions, trading and markets, investment management, and corporate finance on a host of issues, litigation, policy making, rulemaking, doing economic analysis, and also we provide the data infrastructure backbone for the Commission. And I'll just give a disclaimer that everything that I say here today is my own interpretation of the world, not that of the Commission or any of the other Commission staff.
Daryl Ashton from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. I'm a section manager within the Office of the Chief Data Officer. And the group that I am responsible for does data management, data integration, and data dissemination centrally for the board. As a kind of a broad topic, data management, data governance is what the Office of the Chief Data Officer has been tasked with doing ever since the conclusion of the financial crisis. It's something that the Board of Governors is relatively new in tackling as a professional service. So from that standpoint, we're babies.
My name is Con Crowley. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Data Officer for the Office of Financial Research.
Thanks, Con. Thank you all. Well, those of you who have been, this is not your first conference. If you've been a member of the coalition for a while, you know that the movement's changed quite a bit since it was created. It's not the novelty, the federal adoption of standards. In fact, in some sectors, federal government is starting to take something of a leadership role. So my first set of questions for the panel, and I'm not going to ask particular people, so jump ball, is whether we gained anything from the early initiatives. Did we get a reality check? Any lessons learned? Are we solving the same problems with each initiative? Were there any surprises? First I'll just ask if the panel agrees that we're sort of in an Act 2 now, where we're moving from a pure compliance driver to a cost driver. Well, maybe I will ask particular people.
All right, so I'll address
Thanks,
that. Where we are moving to a cost driver, particularly the LEI. One of the main drivers initially was the need for to have this identifier. It's something we didn't have. It was something the industry wanted. It was something that regulators needed to have. And coming out of the crisis, we recognized that it was essential. And so now we're seeing it beginning to get some traction. It is still in its early phases of adoption. But we started to hear some anecdotes back about what it means to some of the private sector firms in terms of the costs and efficiencies and improvements in data quality. So it's just beginning to take hold in that sense and moving toward achieving some of the promise that it has for reducing costs and improving data quality.
Thanks.
Maybe I can add to that and just kind of echo some of the sentiments of the last panel that talked about the need for regulators to actually require the use of LEIs for it to be effective. And I think we would wholeheartedly agree with that. And in fact, one of the first major initiatives, rules at the SEC to adopt the LEI was Regulation SBSR, which is swap data reporting. And in fact, it was, I would consider it a very aggressive requirement, in that it not only required that a counterparty use an LEI, but that it also get an LEI for the counterparty to the extent that the LEI provider would let them do that without obtaining permission. So it went as far as we could within our jurisdictional authority to require the use of LEI, and to the extent that that is setting the bar for future such requirements, I think it's a pretty strong statement from the SEC in terms of importance of using LEI in regulations.
So just a little thing to add in there with regards to LEI. So what the board is starting to look at is where does cost start to work against us, because we are heavily invested in our own internal identifiers. If you're familiar with our data, it's the IDRSSD that we use to identify firms and subsidiaries. And so switching over to the LEI is a large cost. Including that in our data sets is not a cost, but starting to look at what is the benefit, what is the cost of doing a wholesale switch and dumping the identifier system that we've been using internally for decades. And that's something that's a real question, a real struggle right now.
Well, let me just follow on with that, listening to your answers. Is the LEI unique in terms of being adopted because it has to do with identity, whereas a lot of the other structured data initiatives actually have to do with the semantics and the interchangeability, the machine readable data, which is a sort of different by nature. Do you think that it seems like, listening to the panels today, LEI is at the core of the movement right now. It's what's getting the most attention, but I'm just wondering, is that, do you think that's going to have any effect on the executive branch's advocacy for and adoption of other types of data standards that are standards around the contents of the data themselves rather than identity?
I can just give my own personal view on LEI. I view that as a mechanism to connect data. It's a translation table between data sets, and it's extremely important for any analysis that requires multiple data sets. And to the extent that LEI is adopted, it makes the various data sets for which you connect with it even more important. So I think one drives the other.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I left out my disclaimer at the start. So yeah, my views are my own, and they don't represent the official view of either the Office of Financial Research nor the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Picking up on the LEI, it was, I would say, the first and most important. And because it is in this suite of identifiers that are necessary to be able to link the data for more sophisticated, complex analysis, as well as what they lend toward the improvement of data quality and its use on a global basis, not just within the U.S., but also on a global scale. So it provides a tremendous amount of opportunity. And some of that has been recognized by the Regulatory Oversight Committee for the LEI, which is an international body of regulators that are involved. So there is that recognition of its importance. But yes, there are other identifiers, the ability to link these data so you have hierarchies that you can pull together, and the structures of the entities that these LEIs represent. There's product definition. The unique product identifier is another key identifier. Now, on an international scale, CPMI IOSCO has commissioned a data harmonization working group that has 3 subcommittees or subgroups, one on unique transaction identification, one on unique product identification, and one on other data elements. So there is a recognition that it does go beyond this single identifier to others, and that there is an essential need for global coordination and cooperation to identify and agree on their contents and format, syntax, et cetera.
Okay, thanks. I mean, so it does sound like right now the thing to work on is identity. That's our limiting factor. Well, let me ask about, how do you see the identifiers being part of the regulatory landscape itself? Use of the identifiers as part of compliance. I know this prospect's been discussed a lot before, but I'm just wondering if that's a question that all the agencies are seeing the same, or whether there's some agencies that haven't even taken up the question. Identifiers as part of compliance and regulation. how it's going to fit in.
So, I mean, kind of echoing the Fed's earlier comments that we have legacy systems that use our own unique identifiers, and for the SEC, it's CIK. And so any regulatory compliance has to take into consideration how we can migrate from one identifier to the other. But for us, the two big issues are legal entities and how would we substitute LEI for existing identifiers. And also, I think another big one is the product identifiers and QSIPs, ISINs, PERMCOs, whatever the unique database is that has a security identifier. That's probably a harder problem, I think, to solve going forward, particularly because of the proprietary benefits to those who issue them and their databases and trying to get uniformity.
So another aspect to look at, every time we have any sort of report that goes out, we're required to look at what's the burden on taxpayers, because we're not funded by taxpayers, but the burden on industry to have to report that information. And so going out and telling everybody you must, as a rule, have a LEI and you must report that, there is some pushback from industry on that. Obviously, if you're talking about large financial institutions, the cost of an LEI is not that big. When you're talking about thousands of small financial firms, small community banks, that's something that more regulation and more requirements are not things that they're especially keen on. And so it's one thing that we want to take into account. It's not just the cost to us, but it's also the burden on the folks that we're asking to report, provide data to us.
Thanks. Anyone want to add anything? Let me switch gears a little bit here and ask if in your agencies there's been either some preparatory or other type of impact measurement, or whether there's a specific language about what's expected in terms of the ultimate payoff for adopting these. Has anyone done within the agency an economic impact? I guess in case of the Federal Reserve Board, it's more maybe about risk than cost. But has there been any discussion of how to measure the impact of the adopting these standards?
Sure, so I'll jump in. Not from a hard standpoint, no. It's still kind of a question of what's the general benefit to this, and then if the benefit seems big, okay, now let's take a look at what's going to be the impact of moving forward with some of those standards. Some of the things we have to do, and other things are ones that we'd like to do from a governance standpoint. Again, identifiers are very important, helps us link the data together, whether it's data coming from other agencies or other private data vendors. But other data standards are just as important, and in fact, in some cases, even more important for some of the specific researchers and policy folks within specific areas, whether it's under supervision, regulation, bank operations, community affairs. They have their data sets, and they're interested in what are the standards across those sets.
The SEC has a statutory requirement to analyze the effects of efficiency, competition, and capital formation in its rules, and we also do an extensive economic analysis on any policy initiative. And so for both LEIs and structuring data or any requiring any registrants to provide data in a certain form, we go through a notice and comment process. We propose a rule, put the public on notice, we collect comments, we aggregate those comments, and we reflect those comments in the final decision. We describe very explicitly how we arrive at decisions and the inputs, the very tangible costs that are reported to us so that we can measure the intangible costs and also the anticipated benefits. Even if they're subjective, we assess them all, and so that's reflected in all of our rules. And I would say every single rule that we consider right now, structuring data and requiring certain identifiers isn't every single one, and our chair has made a commitment to making those evaluations and all new rules going forward. So it's a very strong consideration in everything the SEC does right now.
Thanks, Scott. How about the engagement between your agencies and the financial industry, the regulated? I know on, for instance, the standard that we've been mentioning the most, that engagement's been sort of a little arm's length through ISO and ANSI. Is there any direct interaction specifically on these standards that's solicited, much like public review and comment is done with the SEC for the rules themselves?
Sure. So we do reach out to industry. I'm not part of those discussions, so I can't speak to that point. But our group does, whether it's the actual business lines that want to actually use the data that we collect for supervisory purposes, or the folks in the office of the chief data officer that are responsible for moving any of the proposed collections through the review process. We do go out to industry. We have an annual financial services roundtable where, whether it's specific industry members or any of their advocates can come in, and we do tell them, here are some of the compliance issues that we're looking at. Here's some of the new proposals that are coming forth. They talk to us about what the burden is on their organizations, and just give us feedback. And we're trying to do more of this. It's been done not necessarily at arm's length, but at limited times, because especially during the crisis, there was a lot of angst as some of these collections were just popping up left and right, and that does create a huge burden on those industry partners. So we're trying to do a lot more outreach now to give people more of a say in what we're trying to collect.
Thanks.
Yeah, from our perspective, we participate in ISO and X9 and MISMO and a number of the consensus standard setting bodies in the industry. We also have an advisory committee that has private sector participation as well, and they provide us guidance, and we have twice a year public meetings that can be attended. So I would say it's primarily that we're working or seek to work in partnership through these established organizations to work together.
And how about among the agencies? I mean, only 3 are represented here, and there's a lot more that are undertaking these kinds of initiatives. Is there much knowledge sharing, cooperation? I guess the coalition's one platform where you get to interact with other agencies, but I mean on a more formal basis under the federal government umbrella?
So I'll take that one too. We are all members of the Financial Stability Oversight Council. And one of the authorized committees there is the Data Committee, and that provides a forum. It's a collegial body where we meet to discuss any number of data issues, but that would include data standards. Separately, there are initiatives that we have undertaken and that we are working on a bilateral or more basis with other members of the council. For example, we have a repo pilot, repurchase agreement pilot, where we are working in partnership with the Federal Reserve, and with also the SEC and the Federal Reserve Bank in New York are participating. We have been working for over a year plus with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission on data standards in the derivatives space, and more recently we're looking to do some additional work with the Securities and Exchange Commission on similar standards. I'll add to it, we all, not all, but a large number of us are also participating in the CPMI IOSCO initiatives and the Financial Stability Board, the FSB initiatives. And these represent coordination points and that have launched specific standards efforts. The FSB championed the LEI for quite a bit. And there is now the Data Harmonization Working Group, which is taking place under CPMI IOSCO. So these are forums where we also get together specifically to talk about data standards.
That's great.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's probably more coordination than the public might see in terms of the collaboration. I think the last panel was a really good panel, and they brought up this issue a lot of times. For instance, the CFTC and the SEC, there's only 2 joint rulemakings in Title VII, and how much are they talking together? In fact, that's quite a bit. There's a big difference between trading commodities and securities, and so there's natural deviations, even though they're both swaps, on how you might pursue rules, but on items like trade reporting, SDRs, and data bottles that would account for FIXML or FPML swap standards, reporting standards. There's a lot of dialogue that takes place to make sure that we are harmonized in those dimensions, and just rulemaking at large. When we engage in rulemaking activity, there is a lot of discussion between our counterparts to make sure that there's a consistency between the agencies and the approach. And often what you will see are big frictions and more fundamental shifts in approaches that don't reflect all the little items that get worked out in the background that never really see the light of day.
Is most of the feedback from the same part of industry or about the same subject? Just trying to get a feel for the feedback that you do get back from industry, if any, worth noting.
It varies. That's a terrible answer, but it's true. So we take in all comments during our public review period. Some would say we post all of our proposed rules for a certain period of time, and any feedback, whether it's from specific financial industries or somebody sitting in their parents' basement who cares to send us a message, and they can do it electronically, they can mail it, and people still do mail us their responses to things, and we're required to address every single one of them. Some of them are useful and they are taken into account. Others are, all right, just forward those on to the Secret Service because those people are crazy. But, the easy answer is it varies. It depends really on what the rule is and more broadly how people believe it will affect them.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add that the SEC spends a lot of time engaging the public on its rulemaking and industry in particular. And then, as a matter of fact, most, or if not many, or all of the standards that we adopt generally are industry standards, and we try to conform to what the industry is already doing. And swaps is a perfect area for which we've heavily relied on industry practices to try to codify the rules. And so we spend a lot of time talking to ISMA, members of SIFMA, and other market participants that come in and tell us how the market works and what is the lowest cost way to implement the rules. And when there's already a solution in place and there isn't a market failure, then codifying that market solution is by and large the best approach to take.
So we talked about the early initiatives and what benefits they might have. Just to go to present day, since the last time the coalition had a conference, are there any notable events, either internal or externally from legislation or policy that have happened in the last, I guess it would be a little less than 6 months? I mean, I'm not trying to manufacture. My assumption is, to my knowledge, there haven't been any. We're really trying to implement policy decisions that have been made a while back, and there's nothing noteworthy in terms of an event that affects what we're talking about today.
I guess I don't see Hudson in the room, but he's been a longtime fan of the SEC and its progress on structured data. But, I've had many conversations with him and others about what the SEC is doing in the structured data area. And, the approach we've been taking over the past several years, or 3 years in particular, is you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And there's a lot of incremental progress that's been made over that period, including the last year. And just yesterday, sitting down with some of our staff and just outline all the things that we've done in the past 12 months, there are a lot of advancements that have taken place in terms of structured data, structured disclosures, making data available to the public, and in improving standards or creating standards, and just some of the significant rules over the past 12 months in Reg AB 2. We provided structured disclosures, loan level disclosures, and the asset classes that purportedly caused the financial crisis. Regulation SDR, now SDR is required to file their financials in XBRL. SPSR, we've adopted some rules and said going forward we're going to harmonize different industry taxonomies and create a common data model for swap reporting. We've proposed several rules, import in particular for funds, which was mentioned in the last panel, monthly portfolios, improving ADV data that we collect on investment advisors, Title IX of Dodd-Frank Act, pay for performance, pay ratio, a lot of these executive compensation rules. We've actually proposed for the first time to tag elements of the proxy statement, which is a very big innovation for us. And I will just point out that we have received comments on tagging the proxy statement, and there's a lot of industry opposition to the SEC doing that. It's been expressed by very reputable sources, arguments such as this data won't be useful to the investors. They will take it out of context. It's not financial data. It shouldn't be tagged. They'll stop reading important narrative disclosures. And so there is significant pushback from the industry on the SEC's proposing to tag different types of data and making it more accessible to investors. And by and large, we don't get the same sort of comments from users of data saying how valuable it would be or why we would want it. And so in our comment process, there can be an imbalance at times in terms of the views that we receive. So that's just for the audience here, to the extent that you think it's important. The SEC would love to hear your voice when we propose these data standards and rules.
Anybody else?
Just in terms of what's been done recently, but before the end of the year, the board will release its 2016 to 2019 strategic plan. The public version will be available on the public website for any to look at. And in this plan, there are 6 major pillars. Data is one of those pillars. Within that pillar, there are 5 different objectives. One of the major objectives in there focuses on open data and data transparency. One of the big hurdles that my office is trying to get past with some of the existing staff is making them understand the difference between data openness and data transparency. There's a lot of confusion, especially in the regulatory area, where people are very concerned about finding out, or about the public finding out about data that we have, very confidential data that we have on certain financial institutions, that could be very market-driving information. And so trying to limit that, the ability of that data to get out, understanding that that's different from just people knowing that we have that information. And so the biggest work that we've done in the last 6 to 9 months is really on the education side, because we really do want to get to the point where we're able to release more data, be more transparent about the data that we do collect, and be able to provide that information in a very useful manner to the public.
So those of you that are involved in standards adoption know it's kind of an endurance event. And the process, as done by standards bodies, puts a big premium on integrity of process and including input from the field. But one of the things that you hear a lot here in Washington, not just in this domain, is that it's a challenge for the federal government to keep going at the pace that private industry is going. Open data is not just an initiative found in the federal government. The technology community is pushing in one way, and the data business is pushing in another, the development of technology, et cetera. Do you think that the federal government in general can move at the same pace that the outside world's moving with data now? And regardless of how you answer that, I mean, is it critical anyway for the government to do that?
Well, I think it is important for the government to keep pace with the private sector, and I do think in many dimensions we do, at least at the SEC. We invest heavily in technology. We have computing environments that are very sophisticated. We adopt scalable platforms like Hadoop. We have an enterprise data warehouse. We have different computing environments depending on the types of analysis that we do. We have very sophisticated analysts who program in sophisticated languages to do ad hoc type of analysis. We have very scalable information delivery systems for less quantitative staff. We have the consolidated audit trail that's in progress, which is going to be a monumental shift in the way that we monitor financial markets and collect information. A lot of this is outsourced to self-regulatory organizations, which the SEC monitors. So there's a number of different solutions to dealing with big data problems. And frankly, one of the biggest problems that I personally see is that we are collecting a lot more data, and that data isn't necessarily as useful as the data we used to collect, because we're far less discriminating on what it is that we're measuring, because it's very cheap to measure. We have digital cameras, and in the old day when we paid for film, we were very careful in the pictures we took. Now we just snap them off, and then we're left with 1,000 pictures after a 2-day vacation to figure out which ones we want to keep. And so we create a lot of the burden that we face right now just because we're less thoughtful about what information it is that we're collecting. So, the dark side of the proliferation of data is that, on average, it's becoming less useful.
Anybody else? We're 5 minutes after the hour. I'll pause here. We have some more questions, but I'll pause here to make sure we have some time for questions from the floor. Are there any about anything that's been discussed? Yes. Michael.
Thank you very much. We've been hearing a lot about the standards and the sheer number of standards existing in this financial world is just extremely surprising. We have FPML for OTC derivatives. We've got ISO 20022 for a broader set of messages and transactions. We've got then aggregated standards like XBRL, SDMX, not to mention anything in between. And I'm thinking, which way would US regulators, perhaps present on the panel, go about bringing more common understanding about these data pieces that are actually described among these standards? For instance, FPML describes financial instruments portfolios in one way, whereas, let's say, Basel Accord and DPM dictionaries created by the European Banking Authority, or EIOPA, in Europe, they describe the financial instruments portfolios in a completely different way. Now, aggregating this data between these transactional standards and more supervisor aggregated standard is quite challenging. Is there any plan to harmonize the understanding, the logical models that I believe, Mark, you mentioned once or twice over the discussion? Is there any plan to harmonize those logical models, or are we trying to bring more interoperability between these different standards in the future? What's the, so to say, path forward in this area?
Well, let me compact your question, probably not fairly, but just leading up to what's been asked, I mean, what does your agency or even you see as what's next, the next let's say non-identity standards initiative that you would not be surprised to see? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the future. I know it's very hard to, but what's on the second horizon for the agencies? What's the next important thing to work on?
I'll pick up a little bit on the question. The CPMI OSCO Data Harmonization Working Group, I think, is addressing some of what you're speaking to. And there is the first consultation paper focused on other data elements beyond the identifiers that is now out for public consultation. This represents exactly that type of effort to begin to harmonize other data elements, the definition, some of the syntax. And as you can imagine, it is a very difficult process. I think anyone who's been through, even in the private sector, a critical data element identification and harmonization even within a company can appreciate how difficult it is to arrive at a single, even internal standard for a given set of data elements. And why it starts with critical data is you don't try to address the 20,000 or so that you have. You get to the core ones that are really essential to making your business operate. And this is a similar focus that's been taken to focus on what are those really essential critical data elements that are necessary for supervision of the derivatives markets. And this is a global effort where we have the multiple regulators at the table seeking to do this. And so to your question, what is next? It is beginning to address what are some of the other data elements. We haven't, as I had mentioned earlier, we haven't solved all the identifiers yet. There are still identifiers that we need to be able to get in place. And those need to be addressed. And we're not talking about dozens, we're only talking about 3 or 4. It starts with the LEI, but it does begin to move on.
Thanks.
I would just add that, reporting languages like FPML and FixML, they arose from different needs as the master agreements versus transactions or messaging. But you can create a common data model, and at the end of the day, the analysis that we do and use and perform on that data has nothing to do with how we ingested it. And so those reporting languages are relevant for how we ingest it and organize it internally and have it structured internally. And once that happens, whether something's reported in FPML or FixML, that no longer has meaning once we do our actual analysis of the spot markets. And to Crom's point, knowing what is the right information to collect for price-forming transactions in the spot market, for instance, is, I think, more important for our regulatory and monitoring efforts.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? We have 5 minutes left. Well, I'll use the 5 minutes for a question of my own. It's about the definition of open. Open data has been the term that we've all been using to talk about this phenomenon. But regulators are in an interesting position in that not all their data can really be open to the public. When I asked about keeping up with technology, Scott gave a great, concise overview of the technology inside the SEC. But I guess I'm asked, this question is more about the citizen-facing or the investor-facing, public-facing part of your operations, and how you see that evolving in the next few years, either because of the standards that we've been talking about today or for other reasons. The public-facing side of your operation.
So I'll jump in, and I'll put a disclaimer here. This is kind of my wish, not necessarily the board's wish. But really, from an open data standpoint, yes, we can't provide all the data that we have. It's just not possible. There's a lot of things that we collect that are given to us strictly under the rule that we cannot disclose that information. So we do face that problem, but there is the transparency side, I think, is less of an issue. Saying that we have this data does provide some level of confidence in what we're doing, and there doesn't need to be this idea that regulators, the board specifically, is kind of the magic person behind the screen, and you don't really have any insight into what they're doing. And so being more transparent about the data that we have, not necessarily fully open with that data, definitely goes a long way. Now, that being said, there's probably additional data that we could open up, looking at it from the structured, unstructured side. Anybody who's gone and looked at FOMC meeting minutes, there's tons of data in those minutes. They're not necessarily structured, and we do get lots of requests to provide structured versions of that data. And so those are certain things that is not necessarily an open issue, but are things that we want to try and look at from a structured data perspective.
Thanks. Anyone else as we wind up?
I would just say the SEC, unlike a prudential regulator like the Fed, we're very much a transparency regulator, so openness and providing information is basically our mission statement. I'd also mentioned that a lot of the tools that we're developing, like we just launched a new rendering engine for XBRL data, and that's code that we developed internally and with the help of a contractor, and that's open source, like in past releases, and that's available for vendors to use, and anybody who wants to use that code in the future, I would expect similar types of innovations we made available in open source too. But at the end of the day, our mission is mostly to make the information available, and we rely heavily on the market to provide the innovation and the uses and applications for that data. And so our job is to make your job easier to the extent that your job is to sell services to the financial sector.
Great. No? Okay, I think we're going to end right on time. I want to thank the three panelists from the executive branch agencies, and thank you for investing 45 minutes in the session.